On today's episode of Locked On Wild, a long overdue look at some of the top Minnesota Wild prospects.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. On today's episode, Sebastian Heidt of Locked On NHL Prospects joins us as we take a look at some of the top prospects in the Minnesota Wild organization. Plenty of names that you know, and plenty of names that we'll be trying to get you to know a little better here on today's episode. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild, and joined, as mentioned, by Sebastian Heidt of Locked On NHL Prospects. Sebastian, glad to have you on the show here today. Perfect time to just get a little check-in on Minnesota Wild prospects with the Four Nations face-off underway. And, there's never a bad time to talk about the future of any team in the NHL.
And especially a team that drafts like the Minnesota Wild does. I mean, there's a real collection of fun prospects in this pool. And I think that over the past half decade, we've just seen like a really consistent run of intelligent draft selections and pointed ones as well. Like the Minnesota Wild are very deliberate with what types of player they want to invest their assets into, including their draft picks. And I think it shines through in the players that we're going to be looking at today. You're going to see a lot of players that work hard, that are intelligent thinkers of the game. There's definitely that trend that goes through the entire prospect pool because that's what the administration as a whole values quite highly.
So I know you put together a top 10 for today's episode, and so let's start with that, and then we'll talk about specific players throughout the rest of the episode. But I'm curious to get your thoughts as to what constitutes the top 10 of a very deep Minnesota Wild prospect pool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all starts at the top, and that's with a dynamic talent that could really be a star player in the NHL, and that has to start with Zeev Buium. I think that he is, this season, put some distance between himself and the pack in Minnesota's prospect pool as the top player. I think that a potential pairing of Zeev Buium and Brock Faber is the stuff of dreams, not just for Minnesota Wild fans either. I think just for fans of the game of hockey. Those are two just quintessentially modern, 2020 style NHL defenders, and they think the game very well. They're not the biggest ones, but they have good leverage mechanics. They're not players that are easy to push off the puck. They're still quite resilient despite being smaller, and they have that elite level mobility and just the connective passing plays in the offensive zone that you see every top team having. And especially at the Four Nations face-off now, we're really getting a front and center view at what the very best players in the world can do. And it's all about pace. It's all about quick passes. It's all about knowing where one another are going to be. And if you're looking from the blue line, I think a Faber and Buium kind of pairing has some kind of similarities to Canada's top pair and Colorado's top pair of Devontae's and Cale Makar in terms of how the players can play between one and the other, where I think Faber has a bit more of Devontae's in him, and Buium isn't as dynamic as Makar, but definitely has some of those traits in the offensive zone.
So obviously that's going to excite a lot of Wild fans because Zeev is a player that we didn't expect was going to be available when the Wild drafted, and then all of a sudden, poof, he happened to fall to them, and they certainly benefit from it. From what I have seen, he had a fantastic season in Denver last year, and as you alluded to, Sebastian, he has really started to kind of build off of that and push towards just a strong finish. I'm super excited to see him. I think getting here at the end of the year, once the NCAA season is done,
He
think
has
it's pretty, it's pretty evident that he's going to get at least a few games to see where he's at in his process.
Absolutely. Like in the last 10 games, this player has not played less than 25 minutes, or he's played less than 25 minutes once in the last 10 games. And the last game he played 34-28. He's getting triple shifted at the college level. This has to be his final season. There's nothing left to prove.
Who do you have at number 2?
At number 2, I still have Jesper Wallstedt. I think Minnesota Wild fans will be rather painfully aware of the growing pains with this player this season, both in the AHL and the NHL. It's not been an easy year for the big Swedish netminder, but I still see a really intelligent, mechanically sound, athletic netminder, 6'3", 214 pounds. He's still just 22 years old. This is one of the things, like, yes, he had all this hype in his draft year because he did something that was unprecedented for a draft year netminder to, like, not just like do well, but play exceptionally well at the SHL level. 42 games, 908 save percentage in a draft eligible season just does not happen for goaltenders in a league as strong as the Swedish Hockey League. But the pains have been there in his development. But I think that you give him another year, 2 years, and you're really going to get a gem out of this player. Goalies take a while to refine, and 22 years is not anywhere near the age of where a goalie's expected to be at their prime or really pushing into an NHL lineup. But the expectations have understandably been altered for a player of the caliber of Jesper Wallstedt. But I think he still is due a bit of patience in his development. And he's still number 2 for me, but it's not as certain as his hold was in the top 2 earlier on the campaign. And I think even still in the summertime, he was at number 1 for me ahead of Zeev Buium, but that has definitely changed now.
Yeah, it's interesting, the case with Jesper, because you look at the numbers in Iowa. He's battled some injuries this year. The Iowa team that he's playing on isn't great, so that's certainly
so young.
Yeah,
like the whole decor is all like U22 basically.
So that certainly factors in, but I think people should take solace in the fact that, you know, he still is a big part of the process next year. He's going to be on a one-way contract, so he's going to be at the NHL level next year. And even though the results at this point, the numbers don't look great, I kind of charted too that a lot of the goals that he's given up have come in a few starts. So you take away 3-4 kind of lackluster starts, and the numbers don't look too bad. That's just part of the process that young goalies go through.
It really is. And I mean, also like the 2 NHL starts he had were against Vegas and Winnipeg. Like he was kind of set up to not look ideal in his 2 NHL games so far this season. I think that if you're playing against basically any other team in the league, he would have looked more okay at the very least. But yeah, it's going to take a bit more time. But I think next season, he's really going to have an opportunity to also prep for an entire summer to be the backup. And I think that like stability in his role is also going to help him a lot in his progression.
Yeah, 100%. Who's number 3?
At number 3, I have David Yurichek. So I think also a player that perhaps Minnesota Wild fans are feeling a bit tentative on at the moment, not knowing exactly where to stand, because he hasn't produced massively with Iowa or played really big minutes at the NHL level with Minnesota, but still a player that I think everyone that's watched, you can see the raw tools that he possesses. The wicked shot, the high-end anticipation, the aggression, both offensively and defensively, are really big assets. And I think that there's definitely hope for him to become the number 2 right D behind Brock Faber. And I really think it's going to benefit his development that there's not the pressure on him to be the number 1 guy on the right side. A number 2 role against like lesser competition where he can feed offensively, I think fits so perfectly for his style of play, especially if he's able to kind of develop alongside a player like Jonas Brodin, who can insulate him with his experience and intelligence, defensive responsibility, and mobility. That'll go a long way. Yurichek definitely still has to work on his skating a little bit. Like the stride's choppy. He struggles to catch back up to play when the puck gets past him. But there's growing pains here, but that's always been the outlook since his draft year. I don't think that his stock has shifted all that much since he was picked in 2022. There's still a very raw player with massive upside offensively. The flashes of playmaking creativity are the best among any defenseman in the Wild's prospect pool, including Zeev Buium. But the consistency is a question, and again, defensive mishaps and skating, there's the question marks that I think all the fans know at this point. But I think Iowa was a good place for him to develop, and I wish that they could maybe bring in a veteran to help insulate not only him, but the other like really, really young defensemen that are just entirely in that decor in Iowa.
Yeah, it would be nice to get a little veteran help down there, but that's a topic for another day. We'll continue going through Sebastian's top 10 Minnesota Wild prospects list as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on NHL Prospects after this. Today's episode is brought to you by SelectQuote. In sports, having a winning strategy is everything. It's how the best teams make it to the Super Bowl, the World Series, and the Olympics. The same goes for life. Having a strategy like life insurance from SelectQuote can protect your financial legacy and keep your family's future secure. SelectQuote makes it easy to find the perfect life insurance policy. As one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, they've helped over 2 million customers find $700 billion in coverage since 1985. What sets SelectQuote apart is their personal touch. Unlike other brokers that offer one-size-fits-all policies, their licensed agents tailor coverage to fit your unique needs. If you're in good health, and you might even qualify for same-day coverage of up to $5 million. No medical exam required. And it's more affordable than you think. You can get up to $1 million in coverage for as little as $20 a month. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Go to selectquote.com/lockedonnhl today to get started. That's selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. Welcome back to today's crossover edition of Locked on Wild and Locked on NHL Prospects, part of the Locked on Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day. Joined by Sebastian Heidt today as we continue to go through the top 10 list of Minnesota Wild prospects. Sebastian, we left off at number 4.
Indeed. At number 4, we have a player that I think Wild fans are perhaps even more familiar with than the other names that we've mentioned here, because he's been playing extensively at the NHL level this season. That's Liam Ohgren, who has been playing excellently with the Iowa Wild. He's basically at a point a game this season there. And I think he's been really showing his offensive side at the AHL level and his defensive side in the NHL. And it is those dual realities that made him such an interesting prospect in his draft year campaign, and why they targeted him with the pick that they got for Kevin Fiala in that trade with the LA Kings. I mean, I think that's aged decently well. Brock Faber is a pretty important piece of the team at this point. But Ohgren's also a really, really important prospect in this pool with what he brings. Energy, leadership, intelligence. He's always in the right place at the right time. He takes up supportive positions in the defensive zone. He's always open as an outlet option in transition. Always sticks in those passing lanes, likes that little give and go kind of play, and plays with the kind of pace that Minnesota has been building their team to play with, which is also what I think will allow him to move up and down the lineup once he really gets settled as a full-time NHLer. He's been playing on mainly the fourth line, but he's getting some games on the third line, I believe, as well in the past month or so, where he's been able to show a little bit more of that offensive nuance in his off puck movements and the spaces he occupies in and around the net front. He loves those dirty areas. So he's a player I see long term as a middle six option for the Minnesota Wild, who maybe in his best year could give you 25 goals, but is just going to be a consistent presence, bring energy at even strength, and also value both on the PK and the power play. A very versatile player that is maybe a little bit higher up the rankings here in terms of pure upside than other options, but because he's already showing this ability where he is playing, I think he deserves to be in the top 4. Number 5 has some bigger top 6 upside. And I'd be curious to hear your insight on this player as well, because I think he's a kind of skill guy that fans get really excited about, and with good reason. Riley Heidt of the Prince George Cougars in the WHL is a high-end playmaker who plays with grit and energy. He can play some dirty hockey at times as well as an undersized guy who gets involved in the fray. And there's a reason that the entire organization basically branded him as a steal on draft day as soon as they made the selection. We saw how excited they were just announcing the pick in the first place. But what's your impression on Riley Heidt, and what would your hope be in terms of his actual NHL upside at the end of the day?
I was pretty surprised that he was available for the Minnesota Wild when they in the same draft that they selected Charlie Stramel, second round pick. I was like, I'm sorry, what? And he brings a tantalizing skill set offensively to the table. He has just an innate knack to create and to set teammates up in ways that just are really hard for the average NHL player to do. And the ability to carry the puck in, and his shot speaks for itself too. So he brings something that I think a lot of Wild fans were hoping could maybe even give the team a lift as early as this year, just because it's a team that has, more of the defense and the physicality than the shooting and the scoring skill. We did get a chance to see him in the preseason, and I think showed that there are areas in his game that he certainly can still work on. But as far as the skill, as far as the shot, as far as the playmaking goes, he's very close to being an impact player in those areas. It's just a matter of kind of rounding out the rest of the game.
Exactly. And I think that Minnesota is the right organization to work through that with this player. Like, they're clearly invested in him. He's, I think, also very clearly invested in an organization that believes in him so highly. I think it's a really great fit, and give it a year or two, this is going to be a pacey middle six, like depth kind of scorer who with time could elevate himself in like a true top 6 capacity. But there's less certainty there than with other players like Liam Ohgren, for instance. But a player that I think has some similarities, but definitely brings a bit more of that like defensive solidity at number 6 for me is Danila Yurov, who isn't scoring at quite the same pace this year as he was last season in the KHL. And he's been restricted a bit to middle 6 minutes at the KHL level, like playing like 14 to 16 a night, where last year I think he was playing more 17, 18, pushing 19 sometimes, really being trusted with the bigger minutes in Magnitogorsk. But still a player that brings a lot of playmaking, a lot of pace, a lot of motor, and he's a very intelligent defensive player that fits the philosophy of the Minnesota Wild really well. And I think with the collection of these young two-way players, he's another one that's kind of in that mix that could be a long-term Wild as well, and become a fan favorite with just his two-way solidity and flashes of brilliance on puck too.
And I like, Sebastian, that the Wild have made these types of players kind of their prototypical offensive selection, because I think we see a really good example of what the organization did with Marco Rossi, where you have a player who has the good offensive instincts and the good offensive skills, but maybe just doesn't have the other parts of his game that he needs to be a successful NHLer. And they've shown that they can produce that. Like they can get Rossi to where he needs to be, to where now he's one of their, top 5 players on the team. So I think if you get players that have the instincts and the ability to create plays offensively, you can add the other pieces to their game to be able to help further their development and get them to where they can help out in a big way at the NHL level.
Absolutely. And to add on to that, I also think that building a team with its identity is just quintessentially Minnesotan as well, in terms of just hardworking boys who are going to put in the shift every single night and can bring some offense and flashes, but where really what's valued the most is that consistency, that reliability. That is what Minnesota is building here, and they're doing it in a really modern way with analytics and all these different things. But at the core, it's still just to build that same kind of hockey identity that Minnesota's always been looking to build for their team.
Yeah, fight and bite and some goals
Absolutely.
sprinkled in as well. Sebastian, let's get to number 7 on your list. Then we'll finish with 8 through 10 and the honorable mentions as well.
Absolutely. So at number 7, I have a completely different kind of player to like your fight and bite two-way wingers, and that's Ryder Ritchie, who was a second-round pick this past draft from the WHL. He got traded as well in the offseason. So he was a player that's been adapting to new circumstances with the Medicine Hat Tigers. But like, this is a team with the likes of Gavin McKenna, Andrew Basha. Caden Lindstrom's been out with injury all season, so he hasn't been adding to the roster this year. But there's a lot of talent on this team, and Ritchie was kind of brought in to be like the fourth head of that like four-headed dragon offensively, but hasn't quite found his footing this season. 48 points in 42 games. Good production, certainly, but it pales a bit in comparison to his teammates and the players that he is playing alongside. Gavin McKenna, for context, has 99 points in 48 games, so you maybe hope for some more secondary assists sprinkled in there for a player like Ryder Ritchie, but he still sits on 4th in team scoring. This has been a team that's just been carried by Oasis Wiesblad and Gavin McKenna offensively this season, but he's a guy with excellent handling skill, really great flashes of playmaking, but my question mark with him has always been those things work beautifully well at lower speeds, lower paces, but when he tries to hit that extra gear, tries to play through contact, it kind of falls apart a little bit. So he's a really raw player in my eyes, but he's also a guy he's an August 3rd, 06 birthday. So he was just a month and a half off of being eligible for the 2025 draft. So he has a bit of runway to develop into. He has some time. He's a player that's going to need at least like 3-4 more seasons, I think, to develop into an NHLer, but there's an outside shot at a top 6 piece at the end of that road. The fallback game, I still think, has to develop a little bit, but the raw puck skills are excellent. The shot is wicked. The playmaking is great. He can really become something excellent at the end of the day, but the reason he fell on draft day to 45th, despite having those flashes, is because a lot still has to come together here.
Yeah, and the hope is that, the Brad Bombardier is pretty darn good at player development in the Wild organization, and this just screams like one of those picks that you just say, Brad, do your magic. Like, here's a guy that has a ton of potential, just needs to be molded a little bit. So I'm hoping that's the case for Ryder Ritchie, because I was a big fan of that pick too when it came in. Well, let's finish up. We'll finish 8 through 10 on Sebastian's top 10 Minnesota Wild prospects list. We'll also talk about some honorable mentions as we finish today's special crossover edition of Locked On Wild and Locked On NHL Prospects after this. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. And there's no better place than to get in on the action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth-quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. My favorite part about FanDuel is the fact that you can bet on awards at the end of the season. You can bet on individual games, whatever you're feeling. If you want to have a bet that you track the entire season, FanDuel can make that happen. If you just feel like tracking a couple of games on a Saturday, FanDuel can make that happen. Whatever your desires are, FanDuel is the right place to go. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Final segment of today's special crossover edition of Locked On Wild and Locked On NHL Prospects. Once again, we are your team each and every day. Seth Toupal and Sebastian Heidt hanging out here. And Sebastian, we got 8 through 10 on your list, as well as the honorable mentions. So let's get to number 8.
Absolutely. And honestly, I think you can take the forefront on this first player because you've watched a whole lot more than I have in the last year of Marat Khusnutdinov, who's been playing entirely at the NHL level this season. And I caught a little bit of his last game where he played 20 minutes against the New York Islanders. He got an assist in that game. He's still a player I love to watch. The speed, the intensity, the style he plays. It's still taking a little bit of time, I think, to adapt to the North American style, and it hasn't quite gained that consistency just yet, but the flashes are there. And he's a player I would love to see really hit his gears and become a mainstay in the middle six long term. But what's been your impression of like this first season of Khusnutdinov in Minnesota?
I think you nailed it, because it seemed like for a while the bottom six just was lacking some offensive jump and jolt, and it led to John Hines kind of talking to a few individual players and making a couple of lineup changes, and then all of a sudden you see this game for Marat where he's pushing offensively, and he's doing a great job of eluding players on the perimeter of the zone. And, for me in particular, pointing to that game and saying, there it is. It's just a matter of fully unlocking those offensive skills. I think it just comes down to a confidence issue. And not to say that Marat doesn't have enough confidence. He certainly exudes confidence as a player, but you're going up against the best of the best in the NHL. And sometimes players just get a little unsure of themselves and don't really know, well, I could maybe do that against this player, but not against this other player. If he can get to a point where he consistently just pushes offensively, that's going to marry quite nicely with, I think, a pretty solid defensive game that he brings to the table. I would love to see him get to a, middle six or third line type guy that can be a penalty kill ace too, because the speed that he brings to the table just screams penalty kill for this team at some point.
It reminds me, like, as somebody who grew up in Montreal, a lot of like Paul Byron as a player stylistically, of just having that breakaway speed, but that intensity, that bite to play on the PK and be really effective in that role defensively speaking, but also being able to turn the tide and just launch up the other direction. It's a really fun ace to have up your sleeve as a hockey team for sure.
Yeah, it's just a matter of him just showing those offensive skills a little more consistently.
Yeah.
And when he does that, he's going to take off. I think he has shown, defensively and otherwise, that he certainly is capable at the NHL level. It's just a matter of getting the offensive game to match.
Yeah, for sure. I fully agree with you on that. And I think a player that has almost a similar storyline there in terms of needing to get the offensive game to match the defensive display is Charlie Stramel, if we're looking at the NCAA, a player that had a difficult time at the University of Wisconsin for 2 seasons, both in his draft year campaign and then even more so last season in his D+1. I mean, 8 points in 34 games as a forward, drafted 21st overall. And that being your D+1 production is not ideal, but it has to be said, University of Wisconsin, not a great place to be developing, especially prior to this season. I think it's gotten a little bit better this year with a big turnover in terms of like the coaching staff in that program. But the last 2 years were really tough to watch, and Stramel suffered a lot from that. But he's an intelligent playmaker. He's 6'3", 223 pounds. He's really big and physical, tough to play against. There are flashes of intelligence defensively, being able to really shut things down in his own zone. I don't think there's any top 6 NHL upside in this player to make things clear, even though he is now scoring at like 24 points in 30 games. That's closer to where you want him to be offensively at the NCAA level. But still, I think a player that can bring some depth playmaking, has the handling playmaking combination to maybe suit a bumper role on like a second power play long term. I think that's something that he could do quite well with his frame, with his puck skills. But I think maybe a specialist in that role and a bottom 6 shutdown center is entirely possible and feasible with this player. But I'm glad things have rebounded a little bit for him this season. And Michigan State University is a great place to be developing as a player. So it's a big difference for him, not just for this season, but for his longer term outlook. But to wrap up the top 10. The last guy is like the complete opposite of Charlie Stramel. It is a tiny little defenseman by the name of Aaron Kiviharju, who I think every Wild fan was endeared by the fact of him going up after being selected and saying, "I am your steal of the draft," and fully believing it. The confidence of this player is fantastic. I had conversations with an NHL scout after the draft of a team that did not pick him, and he went on and on and on, gushing about how this was by far the best character interview of this draft, maybe even the last couple drafts, like a human being that every single team would have fallen in love with how competitive he is. So on the human side, I think a player that Wild fans should be elated to have in their organization. And he's stayed healthy this year. That's been the main thing in Liga with HIFK. He has 14 points in 43 games. Nothing outstanding in terms of production, but he's playing just reliable third pairing minutes. He's getting his feet in the water, is getting his body back in just full on game shape after missing much of last year. And I think he's a player that has some real puck moving potential in like a bottom pairing capacity, or if things really break well as a number 4. Like if everything goes great in his development, this could be your mobile puck moving alternative to David Yurichek on a second pairing. But a lot would have to break right for both players for that to be the outcome, obviously. But I think there is that kind of potential, and that's why he's the last player in my top 10.
Yeah, and even if he doesn't quite hit that fourth defenseman role, even if he becomes a reliable puck moving third pairing defenseman, that would be perfectly fine from a skill set standpoint.
And the intelligence and passing skill are top tier with this player. Those both, like last year in my valuation and a lot of other scouts' valuation, passing and intelligence were first round caliber quite easily. The question marks were all around that, like the physicality, being able to withstand pressure. Those are still the same questions that remain today. I mean, we see that a lot with undersized defensemen, but he's 5'10", 181, and he doesn't have that like really stocky lower body to kind of like plant himself on that other undersized guys do. He's not like a Jared Spurgeon in terms of build in that sense, but still a player I think if he hits would be a fan favorite kind of third pairing guy.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see how he pans out, because it takes a lot of confidence to proclaim yourself the biggest steal of the draft, and he didn't even hesitate. He said that he just knew.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like complete straight face. And it's because he fully believes it. He's a very confident individual. And I think that's something that Minnesota was really endeared by. And they went out and picked him, even though there were a lot of reasons not to. Still a player that every single person that, like, I was at the draft in Las Vegas, every person in the media section was like, wait, we're past the 100th pick and he's still on the board? He's still available? What? Another full round passes and he finally gets picked, and it's like, of course it's Minnesota. What a shock. We all were kind of like drawing sticks, and it was like 50-50. It's either Minnesota or Carolina. It's one of those two teams that are taking the swing. And in the end, Minnesota did, and I think that he's an interesting player in this prospect pool. Yeah,
most definitely. Let's just finish with your honorable mentions, Sebastian, before we wrap up.
Absolutely. Just a little quick fire here of some players I think are notable that were contending for the last couple spots in this top 10. Hunter Heidt having a decent first AHL campaign, about half a point a game as he's transitioning from the OHL. David Spacek, Caden Bankier, Carson Lambos, Mikey Milne, Jack Peart. These are all guys in the AHL. These are all U22 guys in the AHL. It's an extremely young team. So again, as context for Jesper Wallstedt's struggles at the AHL level, got to think about the fact that like 5 of your 6 defensemen can barely legally drink in the U.S. just at this point. So it's going to take some time for things to come together, but a lot of interesting pieces there on the blue line. And one more forward who's not in the AHL yet, I don't think, is Rasmus Kumpulainen. He's another interesting player as well. So a lot of like kind of depth guys that could be third pairing, fourth line, maybe third line guys if they hit. But players that I think also play the game the right way. Mikey Milne, I'll give a special shout out to, because that guy works his butt off. He got his one NHL game this season as a reward for it, and I'm very glad of that, because I've been watching him since his Winnipeg Ice days in the WHL, playing with Matthew Savoy and Connor Geekie. He was the most fun to watch of that batch. They were all outshone by Zach Benson, obviously, but no one comes close to Zach Benson in my eyes.
Yeah, he is one in a million for sure. But
Yeah.
thanks for putting the list together, Sebastian. I really appreciate it. Great to get your insights onto these Minnesota Wild prospects. And if listeners are intrigued to hear more, especially as we gear up for the draft, it's hard to believe that in a few months we're going to be in draft season. We're already in draft season, but we're going to be in draft mode here in a few months. So make sure to check out Locked On NHL Prospects so you can hear more as we get closer and closer. But make sure to subscribe to both shows, both Locked On Wild and Locked On NHL Prospects, so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. And you can find both shows as part of the Locked On Podcast Network every Monday through Friday.